Listen to Science, der Wissenschaftspodcast der Volkswagen Stiftung.
It is, of course, my pleasure to welcome our speaker tonight. And I'm not quite sure when you gave us this wonderful title, whether you had already listened to Angela Merkel before or not, because, of course, how can Europe overcome its immigration crisis implies that you are convinced that we can. In that respect, of course, I hope that all of us here can also confirm this positive or optimistic attitude. And I'm particularly happy to welcome you as an expert who has, as you told me, just come over from Canada. We are very happy that you traveled all the way to actually give this lecture. It's probably needless to introduce you to this community, but I would just like to mention a few things. Professor Hansen is the director of the Center for European, Russian and Eurasian Studies at the Munk School of Global Affairs and full professor and Canada Research Chair, which is a very prestigious kind of affair in Canada, only comparable to the Lichtenberg professorships the Volkswagen Foundation offers in Germany. Or the Humboldt professorships, let's mention them as well. And he holds a PhD from Oxford. He has written many, many books. I'm not going to give all the titles. I would just like to mention that you are also one of those who issued a 3-volume encyclopedia on immigration and asylum from 1900 to the present. And we are happy that you will now speak to us, and all I can say is welcome to Hanover again. The floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Herr Kuhl. It is tough times at Volkswagen, I'm sure, but I'll remind you that we in Toronto survived 5 years with Rob Ford as our mayor. So this too shall pass. Thank you very much for that kind introduction. Thank you very much to the Foundation, to the Expert Council, and to all of you for making it here. I would like to talk to you about what I regard as really the defining issue of our time, immigration. And I thought it was the defining issue in July of 2015. By September of 2015, that view was even more clear to me. Voters across Europe, for the first time in years, rank immigration as the second most important issue on the continent to the economy. In the UK and in France, in the Netherlands, Norway, in Denmark, the far right is enjoying very high support in the polls. Even in Germany, which we regarded as a no-go zone for the far right, the Alternative für Deutschland and Pegida are enjoying strong support on the back of the refugee crisis. Since 2001, Islam and Muslims in Europe have been part of a debate which is ugly and polarized. Radical Islam, jihadism, or violent extremism, call it what you will, this appeals to a tiny minority of chiefly Muslims who have, and let us be frank here, signed up to a death cult. At the same time, this tiny minority is interpreted by sections of far-right media and public opinion as representative of the whole complex and varied forms of Islam in Europe. As I do not have to tell a German audience, state breakdown in the Middle East, for which everyone but Germany is responsible, the United States, NATO, Britain, and France, has resulted in refugee outflows at an unprecedented high. At least 60 million people displaced globally. Yet, for all of Germany's very impressive generosity, and generous it is, the vast majority of them are not in the West, but rather in refugee camps and in cities in the global South. Now, these multiple immigration crises are embedded in Europe's ongoing economic crisis, characterized by stagnating economic growth, high public debt, and unemployment levels that threaten a lost generation of European youth. So these are depressing times, even by our low post-financial crash standards. But rather than adding to the gloom, there's enough of that out there, I hope to use this lecture to articulate a number of propositions that, taken together, suggest that Europe's immigration crisis is not only manageable, but solvable. And I'm going to proceed in 4 steps. Sorry, 5. I added a step last night. A brief historical overview, a discussion of the socioeconomic costs and benefits of immigration, a discussion of Islam in Europe, some policy recommendations, and then just a few words on the refugee crisis in Germany, because it would be bizarre to be here and to say nothing about it. Now, the Europe that we know has really been created by 5 or 6 waves of immigration. The first was the great unmixing, the dissolution of empire, beginning with the Greek War of Independence, the breakdown of the Ottoman and the Habsburg empires, World War I, the emergence of Turkey, and that lasted from the 1830s to the 1920s. Almost every founding moment of a nation state was associated with vast displacements. From the 1930s to the 1950s, we had the demographic reordering of Central Europe. Stalin began with mass deportations of every ethnicity imaginable into Central Asia and Siberia, and then Hitler joined in, the expulsion of the Slavs, the decimation of the Jews, and that period ended with the expulsion of the Germans of Central Europe, ending at about 1952. From the late 1940s to the 1970s, we had the guest worker and colonial migration experience, 2 different mechanisms, but very similar immigrants, chiefly low-skilled immigrants coming to work in what was then Europe's booming industrial sector. From the 70s to the 1990s, we entered the period of family unification. Primary immigration ended. When I began my doctorate in 1993 or 4 and told everyone I was working in immigration, they thought it was the oddest topic you could imagine. It was history. Why would you work on a thing like that? Well, we all know that that ended. And from the mid-1990s until very recently, we had a period of mixed migration to Europe. Family reunification continued, asylum seekers, but also Germany, Britain, France opened up for the first time, really, to skilled immigrants. And now we're really on the cusp of perhaps an entirely new wave, massive outflows of refugees that really no one, myself included, saw coming. Let's talk briefly about stocks. Most people in the room will know this. Germany, France, and Britain are the main countries of immigration in Europe, but Italy and most recently Spain are close behind. And to say something about flows, this is the chart here, and the takeaway from this is data from the 2000s, is that immigrants follow the economy. So if you look at Spain, the kind of highest peak there, we see Spanish numbers high around the time of the Spanish boom, shooting right up as the Spanish boom / housing market peaked, and then crashing right back down again and not recovering. And then if we look at the German line, what we see there is stagnating across, crashing down with the crash, and then shooting back up again. Immigrants go where the economy is strong. There's a lot of debate about the importance of a welcoming culture and multicultural policies, and there's lots of arguments in favor of having those, but you don't need them to get immigrants. If you want immigrants, get the economy right, and you'll get immigrants, frankly, whether you want them or not. Now, let's go on to say something about the economics of immigration. And if you read the press on this topic, certainly in Britain, but also in Germany, you'll get the impression that immigration is either the path to heaven, it's the basis of our prosperity, our entire societies would collapse without it, or immigration is the gateway to hell. It brings in social problems, wage depression, displaces the poorest domestic workers, and so on. And what I want to suggest to you is all of that is wrong. Indeed, almost every major claim you hear about immigration is incorrect. Immigration is either a great threat or a great cost to the economy. False. Immigration is a threat to the welfare state. False. Immigration is either a solution to our demographic challenges in some sort of miraculous magic bullet kind of way, or has absolutely no effect on them whatsoever. Both claims are false. Let's say something about immigration and the economy. Well, this is in some ways kind of a disappointing story. The economic effects of immigration are small, and they're a function of the skill set of the migrants and the nature of state assistance. And so when immigrant skills complement those of the country to which they immigrate, i.e. when they're different, you'll have an increase in both employment and wage growth. That's kind of the ideal, from an economic point of view, immigration policy. When they overlap, when immigrants have the same skills as everyone else, you'll have wage depression, and domestic workers will exit the market. And this isn't rocket science. If you bring in lots of plumbers, the price of plumbers, if you allow them to work, will go down. And this should be abundantly obvious if you go to New York City and try and find an American-born taxi driver. You won't find one. It's all immigrants. And that was an industry that until the 1980s, an industry in which the gruff working-class New Yorker, where's it going to be, bub? I can't quite do the accent. That worker, that white worker, was as common as the Cockney in a London cab, and that's entirely changed. Let's say something about the overall benefit. There's been multiple calculations. They all come to the same conclusion, but this was my favorite one. A massive commission in the mid-1990s calculated the economic costs and benefits of immigration to the United States. And it concluded that the net positive benefit for the Americans per year was $8 billion. It's a lot of money for you and me, but that is equivalent of 10 days economic activity in the United States, which is to say, an adjustment in American coffee breaks, or canceling a few American long weekends, they have too many anyway, you would recapture that growth. Yeah. So the benefits of immigration are real, but they're very small. State assistance, well, this is quite simple. The more generous state assistance and the more migrants, or anyone else, but in this case migrants, draw on it, the lower the economic benefit of immigrants. So what people have concluded, what American economists have concluded, is that California, because welfare is relatively generous in California, immigrants who are unskilled impose a cost on the state. Texas, which does nothing for immigrants except to let them buy a gun. That was a joke. You're a tough audience. In Texas, they're a net economic benefit. The main effects of immigration aren't making anyone rich or anyone poor. They're distributional, and often mildly so. So again, citing that US study, you had a slight reduction in US wages in the mid-1990s through immigration from $13 an hour to $12.60, and that reduction leads to two more redistributions towards capital, because they pay less for their workers, but above all to the immigrants themselves. The main beneficiary of immigration is an immigrant. There's also federal spatial effects or distributional effects. Immigrants, like everyone else, consume services mostly at the lender, state, provincial level. They pay taxes federally, so immigrants impose a cost on the states, a benefit for the federation, and that's precisely the debate Germany is having at the moment. To oversimplify, Merkel is certainly keener on immigrants than some refugees, than some lender who pay for them are. Let's talk about immigration and welfare. One of the most passionate debates over the last 15 years has been about the relationship between immigration and welfare. And the question is this: was Milton Friedman right when he said, without needing to run a regression, it's just obvious that you can't have free immigration and the welfare state? And this debate has been so impassioned because in a Berlinian sort of way, it suggests that two things that progressives want more of, immigrants and welfare, are in fact mutually exclusive. And progressives, more than conservatives, are used to eating their cake and having it too. Well, if immigration does threaten welfare, it does so through trust. This is a very famous, very well-known study by Putnam, who concluded that where you have more diversity, you have less trust. Los Angelinos and San Franciscans, only 30% trust their neighbors. People in North Dakota, South Dakota, 90% trust their neighbors. And speaking as a Torontonian, a very diverse city, I not only mistrust my neighbors, I actively detest them. Now, this decline in trust is only indirectly related to welfare, and Putnam, in fact, doesn't talk about it. He's worried about bowling alone, neo-Tocquevillian activities, joining clubs and volunteering, and that sort of thing. But Europeans, and above all Britons, David Goodhart, Paul Collier, and David Miller, they all live within about an hour of each other, actually. They've hypothesized that these lower levels of trust mean that we'll be less willing to see our wealth transferred to other people whom we don't know and don't trust, and therefore will reduce our support for the welfare state. Well, the relationship between trust and increasing diversity and declining trust is clear and incontrovertible, but there is absolutely no evidence, and I refer to Christian Yocca's work on this, there's absolutely no evidence in declining support for welfare or a correlation between increased diversity and decreased spending on welfare. Not at all. Redistributive spending has gone up in Australia and Canada, two of the most diverse countries on the planet. And though they certainly have an ideological horse in the race, because they want to defend Canadian multiculturalism, Keith Banting and Will Kimlicka are correct that there's simply no evidence, I quote, that countries with large foreign-born populations had more trouble sustaining and developing their social programs than countries did with small immigrant communities. Now, every time you think you've got something sorted out, the Americans come in and make it difficult. Because where this relationship seems to hold is in the United States. There, where you have large Black and Latino populations, you've got less welfare spending. People have run regressions on this, and what they've decided, what they've concluded, is that PR plays a role. Where you have proportional representation, small left-wing parties get into parliament, and they push for welfare. So that solves 50% of the difference between Europe and America. That still leaves another 50%, and the authors of this influential study have retreated to culture. This is about American individualism, and they demonize the poor, and so we're back with American exceptionalism. This actually seems wrong to me. The difference, I think, between Europe and America here is program delivery. Most European welfare programs are universal, and where welfare is universal, the middle class benefits from it and thus supports it. Most American welfare programs are means tested and therefore easy to identify with minorities and delegitimize for that reason. Think of, well, many of you are too young, some of you will remember Ronald Reagan's famous Black welfare queen, an attack on aid to families with dependent children. The one major universal American welfare program, Social Security, has massive support. Indeed, it's a sacred cow. In Canada and in Britain, liberal welfare states, universal health care, also massive support. So it seems to me that the way the program is delivered matters much more than immigration, if immigration matters at all. let's say something about immigration and demography. And this debate has rolled out really like this. Those who wanted to defend immigration said, and you hear this said, we need these people to help us cope with aging and declining populations, rising pension costs, rising health costs, fewer workers in the labor market. And then some clever demographer came in and pointed out two things. Immigrants age. Of course, we didn't know that. So eventually they become a cost. Their fertility rates, which are originally higher, converge with the overall population. And therefore, or in addition, you would need a lot of them. So for Germany to maintain its current working age ratio, the relationship between people 15 to 64 and those under 15 and over 64, so those working and contributing and those collecting, for that to be maintained, it was calculated, Germany would need 3.4 million immigrants per year. Now, the country is currently coming much closer than I ever thought it would to that figure, but this is clearly an unsustainable figure year after year. And therefore, the anti-immigration right said, see, I told you so, we don't need these people, they don't help. Well, this is also quite wrong, because if you read the famous UN population study in 2000-2001 that gave us the 3.4 million figure, they also show that small yearly arrivals make a real difference. So imagine in Germany with zero immigration, this country would face a population implosion from 83 million to 55. But if Germany takes in, or 82 million when the numbers is done, it's actually gone up since then. If Germany takes in 240,000 annually, an eminently achievable figure for this country, population falls by 10 million. A drop in population of 10 million is much easier to manage than one of almost 30 million. And gradual population decline buys you time to introduce other measures, to raise productivity, to raise the retirement age. Well, Germany's going in the wrong direction on that one at the moment, and to raise the female participation rate. Now, I want to move on to the politics of immigration, to public opinion, and this has really quite direct effects for the debate in Germany at the moment. The precise economic, social, and demographic effects of immigration, well, I'd like to say in the text it says they can be debated. Actually, they can't, because I've just told you the truth here. So other people will debate them, but anyone in this room now understands this. We can have this debate, but one thing is clear. The management of immigration is only possible if immigration has broad public support, or at least public indifference. If clear majorities consistently oppose current migration levels, then we have a normative and a political crisis. Consistently ignoring the wishes of the public is fairly hard to reconcile with democracy, and doing so risks an ugly political backlash of the sort that we saw in the UK in the 1960s. Think of, Powell, if that name means anything to you. Germany in the early 1990s, when refugees and German Turks were being murdered, and in the UK and the US in the 2000s. The United States under Lou Dobbs, but frankly, again at the moment, has an incredibly ugly and racist debate about immigration, above all in the world's premier immigration country. Well, until recently, public opinion provided very, very little, reassurance for those who are worried about the liberal democratic paradox. Gary Freeman in Texas did research in which he tried to find out where immigrants were popular, and he concluded they were popular nowhere. Western attitudes, he wrote, towards immigration vary over time, but the most widely documented and pervasive finding is that sizable proportions of national publics, usually majorities, either oppose current immigration levels or favor reducing them. Well, I have some good news here. A more recent study suggests it's a much more complicated picture. IOM and Gallup undertook earlier this year a massive public opinion survey, a huge N, and they showed absolutely no correlation between the volume of immigration and opposition to immigration. Indeed, immigration is more popular in countries with more immigrants, and globally, more people want to see the same or higher levels of immigrants rather than a reduction. But support has collapsed in Southern Europe and in the United Kingdom. And it's not the weather that unites these two parts of the world. It's the fact that both have created the impression that they lost control of their borders. Southern Europe, simply by being frontline states in the refugee crisis. The UK, by scoring a bit of an own goal and admitting East European immigrants, which it didn't have to do in 2004, rather than taking advantage of a transitory waiting period. Where the public thinks you've lost control of the borders, support for immigration collapses. And that is, I think, of direct and obvious relevance for what's going on in the Federal Republic of Germany at the moment. Let me move on to Islamophobia and free speech. Now, beyond the economics of immigration, beyond immigration demography, welfare, these slightly technical issues, we've had a debate that has occurred against the backdrop of really three developments, three challenges, I call them, to the liberal democratic state. The first is an increase in Islamophobia. Public opinion polls show that across Europe, to varying degrees, people are more suspicious of Islam and Muslims than Christians or Jews. But even more worryingly, I think, discourse constraints have relaxed to the point where politicians, journalists, supposedly serious writers, will make comments about Muslims that would get them sacked, get them fired, if they made them about Jews or Christians. This is true of Marine Le Pen and Geert Wilders on the far right, but also the successful Eurabia literature, Mark Stein, Christopher Caldwell, Bruce Bauer. Think of Thilo Sarrazin in this country and the success of his Deutschland schafft sich ab. At the same time, we've had an increase in anti-Semitism. For years, authorities have reported attacks on Jewish graveyards, Jews are attacked in the streets, synagogues are attacked, and in July of 2014, in the Parisian suburb of Sancerre, there was an attempt to organize what was almost a modern pogrom, replete with an effort to destroy a synagogue. And we've also had an assault during these years, and indeed before them, on a basic liberal principle, free speech. This started in the Rushdie affair, it replayed itself in the Danish cartoon controversy of 2006, and it replayed itself in Paris, not in November, but in January. In all three cases, artists produced works deemed by some to be offensive to Islam, protests, threats, and violence followed, and commentators, supposedly secular commentators, split into two camps. Those who offered robust defense of free speech, however offensive that speech might be, and those who argued that, although they in principle support free speech, artists and intellectuals should avoid offending Muslims. So, to summarize what we've said so far, immigration has modest but positive economic effects. Increasing diversity decreases trust, but it does not threaten the welfare state. And immigration can have a modest, but again positive effect on demographic developments. These are, in a sense, general structural features of immigration policy, general truths, if you will. In a European context, this debate has played itself out in the context of rising anti-Semitism, rising Islamophobia, and attacks on free speech. So with that in mind, I want to make some policy suggestions for how one might move forward. And the first one is to keep the doors open and the borders controlled. I've made the point in the last one, if you want public support, you need managed, not open immigration policy. But nonetheless, the border should be open, and not only to skilled, but also to unskilled immigrants. Everyone loves skilled immigrants. Merkel, Schäuble, UKIP, everyone loves skilled immigrants. So if UKIP finds an immigrant it likes, you know the debate on that has been settled. So there's no debate about skilled immigration. But there's much opposition to unskilled. And what I want to suggest to you here is that A, unskilled immigration can be economically beneficial, and B, the major progressive argument against unskilled immigration, that it harms the poorest, that argument can actually be seen off relatively easily. And I am basing these numbers on work by Christian Dussmann and his colleagues, which was cited in the Expert Council's report as well. And he's doing, I think, some of the most interesting current work at UCL on the economic benefits of immigration. He has a series of studies, and I'll just show you a couple. One looks at immigration from 1997 to 2005. And I chose this one because these immigrants were actually less educated and less beneficial than the ones who came from Eastern Europe after 2004. And what he concluded is that for every 1% increase in immigration, you get a small increase in wage growth of between 0.1 and 0.3%, and a reduction in the wages of the poorest, peaking for the 5th percentile, the 5% of poorest people in a country, at about 0.6%. So let's run some simple numbers here. UK average national wage was £22,152 during this period. Multiplying that by 0.15%, splitting the difference between 0.1 and 0.3, you get an annual benefit of £332. Again, not much, but there. Assuming at the same time that it imposes this cost on the poorest, who make £6,500, that ends up being a net cost of about £40. So the poorest would lose £40 per year. Well, these numbers are quite obvious. It's very easy to use the tax system to redistribute that loss back to the poorest and actually increase their wages a little bit and still leave immigration as a net positive for the country. These are just wages. When you look at the fiscal effects, and this is a broader period, and admittedly a more skilled immigration, nonetheless the numbers are even more positive. East European immigrants produced a net positive for the UK exchequer of £25 billion. Taxes paid in versus services consumed. Fortunately, it's not always this good. During the same period, and this is Dussmann's work again, non-European immigrants imposed a net fiscal cost of £75 billion. So the question is, what explains the difference between the two? And what Dussmann concludes is that the difference is that welfare take-up rates among East European immigrants, despite what you hear in the press in Britain, are extremely low. They are higher for non-European immigrants. And that takes us on to the next recommendation. Keep income support low and employment high. I am a great fan of unskilled immigration. It only works if those immigrants are channeled into work. It does not work if they're channeled into welfare. And that, oversimplifying only slightly, is the difference between immigration policy in Canada, America, and Australia, where immigrants are integrated into work, and too often Europe, where they're integrated into welfare. Well, how do you get there? Can't solve this debate now, but what I'm suggesting here is TLT. TLC in English, tender loving care. This isn't TLC, this is TLT. tough love, and training. Income support, not for education, not for healthcare, income support in times of unemployment can be reduced to nudge people out of unemployment and into work. And if you think that doesn't work, then you have to say, why was Agenda 2016 so successful doing precisely that in this country, however embarrassed of it the Social Democrats are. And whether you agree with that or not, the fundamental fact is you cannot have a welfare wage, which is above a working wage, and have large unskilled immigration. It simply can't be done. You can have high-skilled immigration and a welfare wage above a working wage, because high-skilled immigrants are not going to be interested in income support because their incomes are so vastly above it. For those at the bottom, it creates a trade-off. And you know who first recognized that trade-off? That great right-wing Tory reactionary, William Beveridge, the founder of the British welfare state, said you can't have income support above the working wage. Next recommendation, keep the speech free but fair. As I said, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and an assault on free speech are all features of contemporary European politics. I say all three again and again and again because I find that this is a sort of a la carte list. People like choosing one or two of them and then leaving the other one on the shelf. Oversimplifying a bit, the right downplays Islamophobia, indeed often says it doesn't exist, and emphasizes anti-Semitism and threats to free speech, whereas the left emphasizes Islamophobia while downplaying threats to free speech and, to a lesser extent, anti-Semitism. I'll retreat to anecdote here. After the January attacks, there's a lot of media in Toronto. I had a huge number of calls. Most of our media is progressive. And they asked me again and again and again about anti-Muslim sentiment in Europe, Islamophobia in Europe. Delighted to answer the questions and discuss it. Not one journalist asked me about anti-Semitism. All three exist, and all three require a common response, which is a robust assault on extremism. In the case of Islamophobia and anti-Semitism, a legal and a rhetorical response is required. In the former, and this is the easy part, current legal prohibitions on anti-Jewish and anti-Muslim discrimination need to be applied, and they need to be seen to be applied. In the latter, the rhetorical, those who argue that Islam is a foreign import incompatible with European values, Stein, Caldwell, Bauer, they have to be challenged and challenged vigorously. The arguments are well known and well rehearsed, but they need to be repeated. Acts of violence are committed by a tiny minority of Muslims, and in the case of Muslims, we're all too quick to associate those minority acts with the faith itself, with all its believers. By contrast, when we see Christians holding up placards in the southern United States saying God hates fags, we don't think for a moment that those people speak for Christianity. When the French socialist government published a bill allowing gay marriage, it was not Muslims but Roman Catholics who poured into Paris from the sticks with homophobic placards. No North American Catholic thought those people spoke for them. Let me say something now, though, about free speech. As I said, in the aftermath and the lead up to the January attacks, as in the aftermath of Rushdie and the Danish cartoon controversy, substantial sections of opinion, Islamic and non-Islamic, most of my department, in fact, held that the publications of caricatures of the Islamic prophet Muhammad went beyond the viable limits of free speech. This is absurd. The right to mock religion, any religion, is so within the bounds of acceptable speech that the fact that there is a debate about this at all is simply mystifying to me. Religious requirements apply to members of that religion and to no one else. To suggest otherwise is to imply that non-Muslims, non-Christians, non-Jews should internalize Islamic and Christian Jewish norms, and that's ridiculous. The principle, however, has to apply to everyone. There cannot be open season in matters of free speech for one religion and then restrictions in the case of another. And for that reason, existing blasphemy laws in Europe, in countries like the UK, are an affront to the principle. They encourage the view among Muslims that Europeans operate a double standard, and they frankly should go. Similarly, the arrest by French authorities after the January attacks of the bitterly anti-Semitic comedian Dieudonné was unwise, however offensive his views. And what of offense? Well, to be sure, publishing crude caricatures of the Prophet is disrespectful and offensive. Respect, however, and we seem to forget this, respect is a matter of choice. Respect cannot be mandated. No one has to respect anyone, and many people believe that no religion is worthy of any respect. Pious Muslims or Christians certainly do not respect philanderers, men who enjoy the delights of gay saunas, or women who like a drink. And this last point raises a further issue. Islam is a large and diverse religion. There are 1.5 billion Muslims on the planet with views, as you'd expect, ranging from the highly liberal with Ismailis to extremely conservative with others. The most religious and reactionary among them, as is the case with Christians and Jews, are the ones that will take religious requirements most seriously. All things being equal, the most conservative and orthodox members of any religion adopt the most uncompromising, literal, and often frankly selective views of religious text. Compare attitudes towards the Bible, or say Leviticus, among Anglicans in Islington, sunflower bag of London, though quite a bit more expensive. Compare them with Pentecostals in the southern United States. And what this in turn means is that those that are loudest in their demands for respect, accommodation, and revisions to liberalism are themselves least likely to extend it to others, such as gays and lesbians. Now, people can say whatever they want in public, but that liberal academics would align themselves with such a reactionary lot strikes me as also mystifying. But it's more than that. It's incredibly condescending, above all to modern Muslims. Because what it says to them is, you poor Muslims, you're not quite as good as the rest of us. We've got rules on free speech that we apply to everyone, but since you can't quite get there, we'll make exceptions for you. Major political philosophers are arguing for exemptions applied to Islam that they would have viewed with horror, and did view with horror. Often it's with horror. It's often the same people, when Christian fundamentalists made demand for exceptions in the 1980s. And in that vein, no less a thinker than the political philosopher Charles Taylor has confidently stated that Muslims cannot understand the distinction between religion and politics. It is hard to imagine a more patronizing statement. Now, I wrote these lines before the events of November 13th, when my mind was on January. But what happened in Paris has only confirmed them. The deliberate and indiscriminate slaughter of innocent civilians, including Muslims, makes it quite clear that these murders have nothing to do with an absence of respect. They have nothing to do with speech, however offensive or not it may be. They were rather driven by an ideology that understands nothing but death, destruction, fear, and theocratic slavery. And once we recognize this fact, once we abandon the ludicrous idea that appeasing these fanatics will somehow bring us peace, we'll be one step closer to grasping the nature of the challenge. Now, let me say something about refugees in Germany, and these are very much thoughts in progress because the situation changes by the day. I just want to put a few ideas on the table and then I'll sum them up and open for questions. The first is that much of what I'm reading in the German press and the comments from some, not all German politicians, is getting it right. The accent has to be on work. We don't like the word integration in North America. We don't use it as much as one does in Germany because we think it implies some sort of forced cultural. But integration understood as education and as work, that's absolutely where the emphasis should be. The minimum wage. There's this debate here about whether the minimum wage should be removed, relaxed, or reduced, given millions of, hundreds of thousands, possibly millions of unskilled refugees. Well, I think it would be perfectly reasonable, actually, to put a pause on the minimum wage. I speak with my social democratic friends, and they tell me that the minimum wage is the foundation of German society, that a massive consensus sits behind it. We can't possibly touch this. And unless I'm wrong, Germany's had a minimum wage for about 10 minutes. So clearly, this country survived and did rather well for many, many years without a minimum wage. Certainly, those same social democrats didn't think that tuition fees were the anchor of German society and the product of a great consensus, and we couldn't reverse those. Circumstances may have changed. In a sense, though, I'm not recommending that. I'm saying it depends. If you have a situation in which these massive numbers of workers create a market wage which is significantly below 8.5 euro, the minimum wage will be a problem. And if one maintains it, those people are simply going to work illegally. So I think it simply has to be monitored, and one has to keep an open mind. But to say under no circumstances should a minimum wage not, say, be taken off the table for a few years and automatically returned is a very odd way to conduct this debate. Indeed, it's quite an ideological one. The idea of temporary one-year permits for Syrian refugees with no family unification, I know that's no longer at the forefront. The Interior Minister's suggestion, this is madness, complete and utter madness. Why? The situation in Syria is not improving. These people are not going to go home. And even if you want them to go home, deportation rates in Europe, I did some research with Matt Gibney years ago, are extremely low. Most asylum seekers, whether they're recognized as such or not, end up remaining in Europe. That 1 year will become 2 years, will become 3 years, will become 4 years. And you'll have people excluded from the labor market, seeing no hope for themselves, and in the worst case, a bunch of single young men with no jobs, no education, no future, no right to bring your family. And evidently people worried about security threats think this is a wise proposal. Values. Well, reasonable people will say, and we should speak openly about this, if we bring in millions of Muslims, they may have more conservative views on gender rights, on the rights of sexual minorities, than does Germany. I think it's an empirical question, not a fact. I think the Iranians are actually a fairly secular, fairly well-educated. I think they're going to look much more like the Iranian migrants to Germany than an earlier low-skilled Turkish migration. But let's see. I think it's perfectly reasonable to draw clear lines and say Germany is a society that values gender rights, rights of women, that values the rights of sexual minorities, and if one doesn't like it, one can find another country. But don't be like the Dutch. Don't make that a punitive lesson targeted at Muslims, as if no one else in Germany falls short in respecting gender rights or the rights of sexual minorities. To retreat to anecdote, my German wife was talking to my father-in-law, and he made precisely this point. The threat to our values. And so she strategically said, yes, I mean, the great thing about Germany is that you can walk through Berlin or through Hamburg, you'll see men holding hands all the time, and the line went silent because she knew perfectly well that these weren't the German values that my father-in-law was talking about or was supportive of. So a general campaign that emphasized women's rights, rights of sexual minorities, rights of ethnic minorities, is absolutely to be recommended. but again, not one that demonizes migrants. Good, I've talked for too long. I'll just sum up now. What I've suggested in these comments is that immigration produces modest, positive economic benefits, that it poses absolutely no threat to the welfare state, and that it makes population aging and decline more manageable. When it is skilled, it's welcome everywhere, where when it's unskilled, it brings a small positive benefit, but it does something else I haven't talked about. Mass unskilled immigration raises the prospects of benefiting both the immigrant, whose wages increase, and the middle classes, who can improve their quality of life through cheaper labor. As the Americans know, mass unskilled labor brings luxuries, what are luxuries in other countries, to the middle classes. Cheaper cleaners, contractors, nannies. They allow the middle classes to have more leisure, to engage in higher productive work, and above all, it allows women to enter the labor force when they're relieved from the drudgery of domestic labor. Public opinions can be skeptical of immigration, but when borders are controlled and migration managed, you can win them on side. And finally, modest levels of income support and dynamic labor markets can help ensure that migrants are incorporated into work rather than into welfare. And this is the essential point. As I said, immigration works relatively well in the country from which I come, not because of multiculturalism. That's what the federal government will gladly tell you. The country spends $15 million a year on multiculturalism. That's nothing. Immigration in Canada works, as it does in America and Australia, because immigrants are incorporated into work. And that's the most general lesson that I think applies everywhere. Immigration policy and immigration works when immigrants work. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this very inspiring lecture, which drew a broad picture and gave us many ideas for tomorrow's discussion and for our future work of the Expert Council. And before we start discussion, I just want to thank you. There is some nice chocolate in it.
Oh, thank you very much.
And it's for your nerves, perhaps, so you can just eat them during your flight. Sugar, it's sugar. So
thank you so much.
I just would like to open the floor to the public, but before I do that, I just want to put a question. What do you think about the labor market integration of refugees? Because we now learn to know that the qualification structure of the refugees is not so high we estimated in the beginning. And at least there are some very preliminary figures saying that 80% of the refugee population has no formal qualification, which does not mean that they have no qualification, of course, that they have no experiences. But what can Germany do? Combination of a very high welfare system, a very generous welfare system on the one hand, and on the other hand, difficulties or great challenges concerning speech, learning German, and just qualifying the population.
Yeah. Should I take that one?
Yes, of course.
Yeah, I mean, the glib and easy part, expensive, but glib and easy, is obviously a massive investment in education and training early on. The German case is complicated, though, because, of course, the economy in Germany is very different from the economy in Canada or America, where we have liberal market economies, Peter Hall, Sosk's work, where there's very little training, we don't have apprenticeship systems, and we basically say, welcome, go find a job, and people become, if they go to university and try and train themselves, or they become taxi drivers, or they go up to one of our department stores and get a job off the street. Even that won't happen in Germany, because to become a Verkäufer or Verkäuferin, you need to be properly trained, which is why, incidentally, they're competent in this country and completely incompetent in Canada. So there's absolutely benefits to training, but it makes it very difficult where you have large, low-skilled immigrants. I think three things need to be thought about. One is getting as many as you can into training schemes. and make sure the children are getting into good schools and acquiring German. On the others, I think one has to think rather radically. One suggestion is removing the minimum wage, but the advantage of a highly coordinated labor market is that Germany can actually think about almost New Deal massive work schemes to give refugees work on projects that are good for the country. I mean, at the end of the financial crisis, Germany responded in the way that no other country could, through keeping employment high and unemployment low, through a government subsidy direct to employers of workers. And one could think of that sort of scheme on a massive scale, where whatever the market wage is for a refugee, the government will top them up to keep them into work. But the numbers here are so massive and the risks are so high that I think one has to think about very ambitious schemes and sober. So you are just humorless tonight.
You wrote an interesting book chapter a couple of years ago, which was also kind of a global overview on what Europeans should do to make their migration work. You brought it down to 2 bullet points: open economy. We heard much about that. That was kind of a big part of your message. But then you had a second message, the Republican state, à la France. And you were saying basically it's better than other ideas, multiculturalism, however you name it. So you were rather quiet on the second one, on the Republican state, as doing it better than, say, a wet liberal state à la Britain. Have you changed your opinion on this one?
No, I've not. I mean, it was implied in what I said on values. I didn't state it as strongly. No, I mean, let's measure this through the evidence. So the Republican system is much more complicated than in practice, as you and people like Adrian has written about this. But let's keep it simple the moment that you have a kind of Republican, more assimilationist model of integration versus Germany's more laissez-faire or Britain's more laissez-faire model. Well, all the evidence has shown time and time again that on the issue of cultural integration, not economic integration or political integration, cultural integration, attitudes on the part of Muslims towards the French, and they're all French, but let me just do this division. Muslims towards French citizens and French citizens towards their Muslim co-citizens. Those attitudes are more positive in France than they are anywhere in Europe. And Jeffrey Wrights from my department and Patrick Simon, am I getting this right? Demographer, have just done a massive, large quantitative study of Muslim attitudes, and they find that what Muslims in France worry about is not the hijab in schools, it's not the niqab. What they worry about is what everyone else worries about: getting a job, finding an education for their children. I think, I've said it before and I'll say it again, I think if you have a positively integrationist model, where you have a set of liberal values that the country proudly believes in, as does America, as does France, and you're inclusive about it. These aren't values that mark you off as superior to newcomers, but are rather values that everyone can join in. You have a better time managing immigration. And what I've also said for years is, this slightly changed since 2006, since the World Cup, is that until the Germans started feeling proud about being German, they certainly couldn't tell the immigrants that they themselves should be proud to be German. So no, I haven't backed away from that position.
You mentioned before anti-immigrant sentiments. You were saying that basically there is no real correlation with the volume, but nevertheless, UK, but also recent movements here in Germany, in the Netherlands, and also in Switzerland showed that politicians may not be able really not to care about these increasing sentiments. What is your assessment? What should they do in practical work?
You mean on the back of the refugees in particular?
Back of the refugees, but also on the back of Muslims in Europe, in the back of well-educated immigrants coming and increasing the labor market and increasing the competition.
Yeah. Well, Switzerland, I'll defer to you on Switzerland, which is an odd case because the immigrants they really don't like are Germans. So, they don't like white, chiefly white, not exclusively white, wealthy, educated immigrants. So Switzerland has always struck me as an odd case. Speaking elsewhere, I mean, I think there's two things. One, I think the German public has to be reassured that the borders are going to be secured again. This just has to happen. If anything, I've actually been surprised by how long public opinion is held up. This cannot go on indefinitely. And there's a debate about how best to do that, but the borders need to be secured, and I think that's true across Europe. That's really what went wrong in the United Kingdom. Otherwise, and it sounds idealistic, opinion is malleable. We need politicians, and this might explain why it's not as bad here in Germany as it could be, who are willing to lead on this issue and defend immigration. And so far, we have Angela Merkel. And I think the third one is Angela Merkel. We're seeing far too little of that in Europe. In the United Kingdom in the 1990s, Tony Blair, whatever you say about New Labour, they defended Europe and they defended immigration, and that can make a difference. So it's a mixture of management and leading. And then, of course, institutional factors come in. Certain political systems and PR systems will do this, will magnify the scope for small parties to pursue, as in Wilders, an anti-immigrant agenda in the way that is tougher in the United Kingdom. The political system, the party system can shut it down more. That's all a satisfactory answer?
Okay, thank you very much. I have 3 points. The first, you spoke about the Putnam correlation of increased diversity and lower trust. I think we have a lot of empirical data in Germany that proves the other way around, exactly the other way around, where the rate or the share of foreigners is low, xenophobia is higher, and the other way around. So I think this does not work exactly and apply in the same way for the question of immigrants, because Putnam is discussing this point in another context, I think. The second point, the picture you draw was a little bit, there are some liberal open immigration countries like Canada, US and Australia, and then there's a lot of other countries that could learn a lot of that. But I'm quite skeptical on, for instance, the integration mechanisms in the labor market nowadays in Australia or in Canada concerning physicians. We have hundreds and thousands of physicians driving taxi as well in Australia as in Canada. Yeah. So I think there are a lot of problems in other economies as well, and we have to differentiate even the wage arguments and the mechanisms of wages. And my third point would be, it's very easy. If I would live in Australia, my daughter is just coming back from Australia after having lived there for 2 years, because being unable, as a physician, her husband, to integrate in the Australian labor market. So it's very easy to speak of controlling the borders if I live in Australia or in Canada. But it's a matter of fact that in Europe this is not possible. And in Europe, we have to abandon the logic of national container societies, because we have in Germany 1 million immigrants and 1 million emigrants each year, or let's say 1.2 million immigrants and 800 to 900 immigrants. So this is a completely different situation. We have Schengen and we have an area of free mobility, and there's obviously no chance to control borders in the same way as I could in an island or in a geographic position like Canada. So could you perhaps precise your recommendation or tell us what we should do or what we should have done or what Angela Merkel should have done when hundreds of thousands come each month?
Yeah. Thanks. I may be reminded. I agree on the first two, and I agree less on the second. So the first one was? Oh, Putnam. Yeah, absolutely agreed. No, entirely agreed. My point was not to say Putnam is right or wrong, and indeed, there's a whole literature saying Putnam's not even right about trust. It was rather to say, even if Putnam is absolutely right, you can concede all of that. This means nothing. Christian's written about this. This means nothing for support for welfare. On the other point, I've written, and I'm a huge believer in the contact hypothesis. Like every hypothesis, it's disputed, and I think exactly that. Where you have contact, meaningful, and sometimes it doesn't have to be that meaningful, contact between immigrants and non-immigrants, between people of different ethnic backgrounds, actual sexual minorities, gay people, straight people, you have more understanding and sympathy. And it is borne out that in precisely, immigrants are most unpopular in Brandenburg, where there are no immigrants, and much more popular in Munich, Hamburg, or Berlin. Absolutely. What was the second one? Oh, okay, yeah. I thought there was a second one separate from that. Yeah. No, I mean, I'm horrified, I have to say, horrified that you think, maybe I've been in the country too long, I'm one of these Canadians that goes around the world saying, the way to solve all your problems is just to become a little bit more Canadian. Indeed, I've spent the last 10 years telling Canadians that A, this is stupid, B, offensive, and C, overgeneralizes from one case. All I meant, not that they get everything right, but they get the accent right. And that the aim should be on work and getting migrants into work. And the sort of regulations, restrictive regulations on doctors and engineers, big debate about this in Toronto and in Canada, those are in fact ways in which the principle is not properly applied in Canada or in Australia. So I'm not for a moment defending those or saying everything works, but rather the aim should be to get people into work. And more broadly, as I said, the liberal economy is very different from a coordinated economy, so those paths will be very different in the two countries. And frankly, it is easier in Canada because you do so little for them. I mean, if the people end up not being doctors, they end up driving taxis, and frankly, no one does anything for them. You have a very different situation in Germany. Where I think I slightly disagree is on the issue of borders. It's not a question of volume. I agree, Germany is a massive clearinghouse, and I think there's an interesting study to be done of all these people who've passed through Germany and gone. I was in a taxi just the other day, and the Navi was in German. So why is your Navi in German? Typical story, oh yeah, I went to Germany first, worked there for a couple of years, came on to Canada. Toronto is teeming with these people. I meet them all the time who've kind of passed through Germany, and Germany as a transit country, and moved on. It's not the volume, it's the capacity to control. Now, in the case of this refugee crisis, I think you're right. I'm not one who said one should have seen this coming, one should have had these massive refugee reception centers sitting there empty. This caught everyone, frankly unaware. That doesn't mean that the goal of getting back to a regulated immigration system isn't a valuable one. And on your point of Schengen won't survive unless we get there. And what I would like to see, I don't do work on this, what I would like to see would be a much more ambitious multinational control of the periphery. It's be very difficult to get there, but yeah, it's impossible, sure. But that would be the goal. Yeah. We could collect a couple, maybe two. Yeah.
I have one remark and one question. The remark is, you basically said that the economic effects are at most tiny. I think this is not totally wrong, because most of the effects we basically cannot measure. About Germany after World War II, this was a totally destroyed country. Before World War II, it was mostly an agricultural country. And without the huge inflow of forced migrants from Eastern Europe, Germany would never have been able to become one of the leading industrial countries in such a short time period. The same argument you can make basically with the United States, with the huge immigration flows in the early 90s. You can make a similar argument with Israel. Without the inflow of highly skilled Russians in the 1990s, Israel would probably not be one of the leading technology countries in the world nowadays. And these very long-run effects, we basically, empirically, we cannot measure. Also with the fiscal effects, there are what we basically know is that there are a lower bound of the fiscal, positive fiscal effects, because much of the things which are happening, you basically cannot quantify, like the value of the imported human capital, or the reduction in costs of pure public goods. Like the German reunification, I always ask people, what do you think how big the solidarity tax would have been if we would have had no immigration?
However, my question comes to the minimum wage, and as an empirical labor economist, I'm not favored towards the minimum wage in Germany. Still, you said one of the main issues is to keep the public opinion towards immigration at least indifferent. Now, one of the biggest fears of the population concerning immigration is that the immigrants take away their job or reduce their wages. Now, don't you think that now cutting back on the minimum wage could lead to the public opinion to change around against immigration?
So in your historical overview, Randall, you missed one thing, which is, of course, EU free movement as a innovation which created a type of migrant that was not an immigrant like others. It was a type of migrant that didn't face discrimination on the labour market as a foreigner. So I'm really wanting to know if you're advocating this border control idea. Border control would, in this case, require basically governments controlling employers and universities and others that actually currently benefit from free movement. And as you say, the UK already controls non-Europeans, and it gets negative selection effects as a result of this. You get family migration rather than labour migration. You get informal migration rather than people filling jobs. All the evidence, as you suggest, for free movement was positive in the UK case. I mean, I would suggest, this is a complicated economic issue, but I would suggest that border controls are not the same as managed migration, and that we need to have some sort of a clearer account here of the relationship of states and markets. It's not really clear which side you're on.
No, okay.
Yeah.
I just might need reminders, but that's okay.
Shouldn't there be a strategic emphasis in this present situation on the millions of people who live or have been taken into neighboring countries of Syria, where many of them are actually living below the international standards of human rights because of, most people here will know because the reasons, firstly. And secondly, you were quite vividly sort of sketching the situation of the young man who is not allowed family reunification, frustrated, no work, etc. Now, I was not quite sure whether you were actually suggesting that we should take in the same rhythm of people plus the millions by family unification. And if you are suggesting sort of this massive process, I would just like to know whether, in your opinion, all the other countries are totally wrong in their decision. I mean, we have Sweden, we have Austria, and we have Germany, but then we have 24 other countries in the European Union who have a quite different view, or the American president who said, oh yeah, Angela Merkel is courageous, but then he said his primary responsibility was for the security of the American people. I mean, are all these other countries sort of off track? Are they all far rightist, including Obama, or maybe should we perhaps learn a little bit of the other countries? Are we Geisterfahrer? As you know, you might know this expression.
Yes, I do.
Are we migrationspolitische Geisterfahrer?
I'll begin in reverse order. I mean, partly Germany is now having the experience that countries in the global south have had for decades, which is kind of it's the second or third, but the equivalent of the first country of asylum, the accident of geography. Everyone's coming there because it's the closest, wealthiest, closest country. They're behaving pretty abysmally, yes. I don't shy away from being moralistic about this one, particularly in the case of Britain, France. Well, France is doing a better job, but Britain and the United States, that really destroyed the state system in the Middle East in 2003 in an illegal war, and we're still dealing with the consequences of that. And then to turn around at that moment and say this has nothing to do with us strikes me as ridiculous. And Adrian disagrees with that, but even if you don't think this goes back to 2003, to have a massive humanitarian crisis and say European solidarity has nothing to do with it strikes me as abysmal. And I have some sympathy for conservatives in this country who might be tempted to say what European solidarity clearly means to the Poles is they can have a wealth transfer from here, but when it comes to burden sharing, the answer is no. We don't have time to get into that whole debate. Absolutely, we need to emphasize that most global migrants are going to remain in the global south. In the case of the EU, I doubt we'll get a distribution mechanism. Frankly, the refugees probably wouldn't stay anyway. No one's going to remain in Latvia or Poland. They're going to make their way to Germany. So I think we need to think about a resource distribution, concentrating EU funds where the refugees in fact go, which is Northern Europe. Your point, Adrian, no, absolutely agreed. No, I'm not suggesting controls and freement with the EU. I actually don't think there should be any immigration controls among wealthy countries with relatively similar levels of immigration pressure. There's no reason that Americans shouldn't work in Europe and Europeans in America. I think that the little own goal on... Sorry? Yeah, and I'm going to go on to that. That I think the own goal there was not waiting. It was a voluntary decision to not invoke the 7-year waiting period. There was nothing inevitable about that. And then failing to manage public opinion. I mean, this absurd 13,200 of them will come, and then the figure is 800,000. That was the disaster of that. You know, in any immigration system, you're going to have these moments of large influxes that create crises. Nonetheless, the goal should be orderly and managed when possible. To your point, it's partly methodological in the sense that when I defend immigration, I like to accept as many conservative assumptions as I can, and then factor them all in and say, after all that, you can still make the case. All I can say is that the economists consistently tell us that the benefits of immigration are small, and that in the absence of those immigrants, the economic system would adjust in a different sort of way. What we also have to say is, if immigration, Canada takes 300,000 immigrants per year, if the economic benefits were so great, why have average family incomes not budged since 1974? So I actually don't think anything that transformative is happening here, though something that is positive is.